The first thing I tasted wasn't the vintage Cabernet I'd just ordered. It was salt. Salt and that hot, metallic tang of blood hitting the back of my throat. It's a taste you never forget, no matter how many years it's been since you were a kid on the playground. But I wasn't a kid. I was a 48-year-old man in a $3,000 Italian wool suit, sitting in seat 3B of a first-class cabin, and my ears were ringing so loud I couldn't even hear the hum of the jet engines. Before I get into the grid of how I ended up with my head snapped back against a leather headrest while the world turned into a blurry mess of gray and red, I need to ask you all something. Have you ever done everything right? I mean, you checked every single box. You stayed late when everyone else went home. You polished your speech until the street was scrubbed completely out of it. You wore the armor, the suit, the watch, the title, thinking it would finally make you invisible to the kind of hate that doesn't care about your bank account. If you've ever felt like you climbed the highest mountain just to find someone at the top waiting to push you off, do me a favor. Drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching or listening from today. I really need to know I'm not the only one who has felt that weight. And if you find any value in this story, maybe hit that subscribe button, because we're going to talk about some things today that aren't easy to digest. This was supposed to be the best day of my professional life. I'm the CEO of a mid-sized tech firm in Los Angeles. We had just spent 3 grueling weeks in New York City closing a merger that was going to change the lives of every single person on my payroll. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that settles deep in your marrow. But I was also flying high on adrenaline. When I walked into JFK that morning, I felt like I was walking on air. I had my briefcase in one hand, a garment bag in the other, and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I've spent 20 years building a reputation. In the boardroom, I'm the guy who stays calm when the numbers are crashing. I'm the guy who knows how to de-escalate a situation with a smile and a well-placed metaphor. My father, a man who spent 40 years working in a factory in Detroit, used to tell me, "Son, your dignity is the only thing they can't take unless you hand it to them on a silver platter." I carried those words like a shield. I thought that if I was professional enough, successful enough, and quiet enough, the world would treat me with the same respect I gave it. The airport was a zoo, as usual. People rushing, shouting, bumping into each other without a second thought. But when you're dressed like I was, charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, shoes shine to a mirror. Finish, you notice the way the sea parts for you. Or at least, it's supposed to. I went through the priority security line. The TSA agent barely glancing at my ID before nodding me through. I spent an hour in the lounge, sipping a black coffee and looking out at the tarmac, thinking about my wife and daughters back in Cali. I was imagining the look on their faces when I told them the deal was done. I was thinking about the vacation I was finally going to take them on. When they called for first-class boarding, I gathered my things. I walked down that jet bridge feeling every bit the CEO I worked so hard to become. The flight attendant at the door, a younger woman with a tired but professional smile, looked at my ticket and pointed toward the left. "Welcome aboard." "Sir, seat 3B is just through there." I stepped into the cabin. You know that smell of a high-end plane. It's a mix of expensive leather, cleaning chemicals, and that filtered, pressurized air that feels thinner than it should. It's a smell that usually means comfort to me. It means I've made it. I was putting my small carry-on into the overhead bin when I first felt it. That prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched. Not watched in a good way, like someone admiring your suit, but watched like you're a stain on a clean white sheet. I glanced down. In seat 2A, The row right in front of mine and across the aisle was a man. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. He had a glass of scotch in his hand already, even though we hadn't even pushed back from the gate. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my hands. Then he looked at my bag. Then he looked at my seat. The expression on his face wasn't just annoyance. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look of a man who felt like someone had just told him his favorite restaurant was now serving roadkill. I didn't think much of it at first. In my line of work, you deal with all kinds of egos. I figured he was just having a bad day. Or maybe he was one of those people who hates sharing his space with anyone. I sat down, clicked my seatbelt into place, and pulled out my laptop. I had a few emails to send before we lost Wi-Fi. I was focused, my mind already halfway across the country. But the energy in the cabin started to shift. You can feel it when the air gets heavy, like right before a summer storm hits in the south. The man in 2A started muttering. It wasn't loud enough to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was sharp, jagged, and directed right at me. Every time a flight attendant walked by, he'd flag them down with a snap of his fingers. "Is there a problem with the manifest?" I heard him ask one of them. His voice was that loud. Carry across the room kind of tone that people use when they want to be overheard. "No, sir," the flight attendant replied, sounding confused. "Everything seems to be in order. Is there something I can help you with?" He pointed a thumb back toward me without even looking at me. I paid for a premium experience. I didn't pay to sit in a cargo hold. "Are you sure this individual is in the right cabin? Maybe you should double-check his ticket." I felt the heat crawl up my neck. That old, familiar burn. It's the kind of heat that makes your heart beat a little faster, reminding you that no matter how many degrees you have on your wall, to some people, you're just a mistake in the system. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on my screen. Stay professional. I told myself, don't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. You're a CEO. He's just a man with too much scotch and not enough soul. The flight attendant handled it well. She didn't check my ticket again. She just told him that everyone in the cabin was a ticketed passenger and asked if he'd like another drink. He grumbled something under his breath and turned back around. But the peace was gone. The shield I'd built around myself felt a little thinner. We pushed back from the gate. The safety video played on the little screens. I tried to go back to my work, but I could see him in the gap between the seats. He kept turning around, checking to see what I was doing. Every time I moved, to reach for my water, to adjust my glasses, he'd huff and puff like I was personally assaulting his senses just by existing. I started thinking about my father again. He used to say that some people carry their own hell around with them, and they'll try to drag you into it if you let them. I decided I wasn't going to be dragged. I closed my eyes as the plane started its taxi toward the runway. I tried to focus on the feeling of the wheels on the tarmac, the slight vibration of the floorboards. I tried to visualize my house, the smell of my wife's cooking, the sound of the Pacific Ocean hitting the sand near our home. But the man in 2A wasn't done. As we lined up on the runway, the engines roaring to life for takeoff, he leaned toward the aisle. He didn't look at the flight attendant this time. He looked directly at me. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a sneer on his face that looked like it had been carved there with a knife. "You think you're something, don't you?" he hissed. The sound of the engines was loud, but his voice cut through it like a razor. "Sitting there in that suit, acting like you belong here. We all know how you got that seat. It wasn't through hard work. I can tell you that much." I felt my jaw tighten. I slowly turned my head and looked him in the eye. I didn't yell. I didn't swear. I just said, "Sir, I'm just trying to go home. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your comments to yourself." He laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Oh, now he's got manners. How cute." The plane suddenly lurched forward as we began our takeoff roll. The force pressed us all back into our seats. I used that as an excuse to turn away and stare out the window. I watched the gray buildings of New York shrink away, becoming a toy city beneath us. I thought that once we were at 30,000 feet, the altitude might chill him out. Maybe he'd fall asleep. Maybe the thin air would calm his nerves. But as the fastened seatbelt sign stayed on, and we climbed through the clouds, the tension only grew. He wasn't falling asleep. He was vibrating with a kind of nervous, hateful energy. He kept calling the flight attendant back, complaining about the temperature, the noise, the vibe in the cabin. He was making everyone uncomfortable. I could see the people in 3A and 4B shifting in their seats, looking at their laps, trying to ignore the man who was clearly looking for a fight. I decided to try and break the cycle. Once we leveled off, I reached into my bag and pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I figured if I couldn't hear him, he couldn't hurt me. I put them on, felt the silence wrap around my head like a warm blanket, and picked up my tablet to watch a movie. Anything to drown out the reality of the man in 2. Oh, I must have drifted off for a second. Or maybe I was just deep into the film, because I didn't see him stand up. The first indication I had that something was wrong was a shadow falling over my lap. I looked up, expecting to see a flight attendant offering me a snack. Instead, I saw him. He was standing in the aisle, right next to my seat. He wasn't holding a drink anymore. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his face was a shade of purple I'd never seen on a human being before. He was shaking, not from fear, but from a rage that seemed so oversized for the situation that it didn't even feel real. It felt like I was watching a scene from a bad movie. I reached up to pull off my headphones, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Sir, is there—" I didn't even get the word something out. He didn't say a word. He didn't warn me. He just wound up and threw a right hook with everything he had. The world didn't go black. It went white. A blinding, searing flash of white light that felt like a star exploding behind my eyes. I felt my head snap to the left, the sound of the impact echoing inside my skull like a gunshot. My glasses flew off my face, skittering across the carpeted floor. My laptop tumbled off my lap, clattering into the footwell. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who I was. I just felt the heat, that searing, throbbing heat on my jaw and the side of my face. I felt my body slump into the corner of the seat, my muscles turning to water. I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt like they'd been hit with a hammer, too. When my vision finally started to clear, I saw his shoes, those tan khakis and brown loafers. He was still standing there. He hadn't run. He hadn't apologized. He was standing over me, breathing hard, looking down at me like I was something he'd just stepped on in the street. "Stay down," he snarled. His voice sounded like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "Stay down where you belong." I heard a woman scream. It was a high, thin sound that seemed to come from miles away. I heard the scuffle of feet, the shouting of voices, the frantic chime of the flight attendant call, buttons ringing all at once. The cabin, which had been a quiet, luxurious sanctuary just minutes ago, was now a crime scene. I tried to move my jaw. A sharp, lightning bolt pain shot up into my ear, making me groan. I reached up with a trembling hand and touched my face. My fingers came away wet, red. The charcoal gray wool of my sleeve was already starting to soak up the blood. Everything started moving in slow motion. I saw the flight attendant, the one who had been so nice to me, running down the aisle, her face pale with horror. I saw a man in the row behind me standing up, his mouth open in a silent oh of shock. But mostly, I just felt the weight of the moment, the crushing, suffocating realization that all my success, all my hard work, and all my armor had failed to protect me from this one man's choice. I didn't fight back. I didn't even try to stand up. Not because I couldn't, although my head was spinning like a top. Hung because I knew the rules. I knew that if I, a 6'2" black man, laid a finger on this man, the story would change. The CEO would vanish, and the aggressor would take his place. I sat there, bleeding into my expensive shirt, feeling the hot tears of frustration and humiliation stinging the corners of my eyes. The man in 2A was still shouting, his words a jumble of hate and entitlement, even as 2 other passengers grabbed his arms to pull him away. He was fighting them, kicking at the air, his eyes fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. "You think you're better than me?" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You're nothing. You're a fraud." I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes against the dizzying swirl of the cabin. I could feel the plane begin to tilt, the familiar sensation of a descent starting way too early. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, but it wasn't the calm, soothing tone from before. It was clipped, urgent, and cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We have a medical and security emergency on board. We are initiating an immediate diversion to the nearest airfield. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." I opened my eyes and looked down at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. I gripped the armrests of my seat, my knuckles turning white, as the cabin lights flickered and the floor beneath my feet began to angle sharply toward the earth. I just sat there, the blood dripping slowly onto the pristine white leather of the armrest, watching the red stain grow. The cabin pressure shifted, a sudden, sharp pop in my ears that made the throbbing in my jaw feel like a hot iron pressing into my skin. I watched that red stain on the armrest, a deep, rhythmic drip that felt like a ticking clock. Every second we dropped altitude, my stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. But it wasn't just the turbulence or the emergency descent. It was the crushing weight of 1,000 memories rushing back, all of them triggered by the coppery taste in my mouth. I sat there, frozen in seat 3B, while the world around me dissolved into a frantic blur of blue uniforms and muffled shouts. The oxygen masks didn't drop. This wasn't a mechanical failure, but it felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin nonetheless. I looked at the man in 2. He was being wrestled back into his seat by 2 passengers, his face a mask of primal, unhinged hatred. And in that moment, as the plane banked hard toward a horizon I couldn't see, I wasn't just a CEO on a business trip. I was a 10-year-old boy back in Detroit, sitting on a porch steps, watching my father come home from a double shift at the factory. My father was a man of few words, but his hands told the whole story. They were calloused, stained with oil that never truly came off, and usually trembling from exhaustion. I remember him sitting down, the heavy thud of his work boots on the wood, and he'd look at me with those tired, wise eyes. "Arthur," he'd say, his voice like gravel, "in this world, they're going to look at you and see a problem before they see a person. You have to be twice as good to get half as much. And you never, ever give them a reason to say you don't belong in the room." I had lived my entire life by those words. I'd polished my shoes until they shone like glass. I'd spent thousands of hours in libraries and boardrooms, perfecting a vocabulary that was precise, neutral, and unthreatening. I thought I'd built a fortress out of my success. I thought the title of Chief Executive Officer was a bulletproof vest. But as I felt the hot blood trickling down my neck, soaking into the collar of a shirt that cost more than my father made in a month, I realized the fortress was made of paper. The slow burn of this flight didn't actually start with that punch. It started 3 hours ago at the gate. I was standing in the priority boarding lane, just minding my own business, checking a few final numbers for the merger. I felt a shove, not a hard one, but a deliberate one. I looked up to see the man from 2A, let's call him Miller, because that's what was printed on his luggage tag. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He just looked through me, like I was a piece of plexiglass blocking his view of the jet bridge. When we got on the plane, the atmosphere was already thick. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you can tell people were just talking about you. It was like that, but across the entire first-class cabin. I sat down, and I could hear the rustle of newspapers and the quiet clink of ice. But underneath it all was a current of resentment. Miller spent the first 20 minutes complaining to the lead flight attendant about security protocols and how anyone can just buy their way into the front of the plane these days. He kept glancing at me, then at the empty seat next to him, then back at me. It was a silent interrogation. "How did you get here? Who let you in?" I kept my head down. I practiced what I call the corporate zen. I focused on my breathing. I thought about the 300 employees back in LA who were counting on me to bring this deal home. I thought about the scholarship fund I'd just set up for kids in my old neighborhood. I told myself that Miller's anger had nothing to do with me. It was his burden to carry, not mine. But then came the mistake, about an hour into the flight. The lead attendant, a woman who looked like she'd seen everything but was still trying to keep her spirit, came by with the meal service. When she reached Miller, he pointed at me with a shaking finger. "I think there's been a seating error," he said, his voice loud enough to stop the clinking of silverware 3 rows back. I requested a seat next to a travel partner, and instead, I'm sitting in front of, well, you see the situation. It's making me very uncomfortable. The energy is all wrong. Can we move him? The attendant blinked, her smile faltering. "Sir, the cabin is full, and this gentleman is in his assigned seat. Is there a specific issue?" Miller didn't have a specific issue. He had 1,000 years of history and a belly full of scotch. "It's a security concern," he hissed. "I don't feel safe with him behind me. He's been acting suspicious, looking at his work too intensely. Who knows what's really on that laptop?" I felt a surge of adrenaline, that old fight-or-flight reflex that we're told to suppress in polite society. My hands were gripping the armrest so hard I thought the plastic might snap. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to show him my credentials, my bank balance, my humanity. I wanted to tell him that I'd probably paid more in taxes last year than he'd made in his life. But my father's voice was there, whispering in the back of my mind. "Don't give them a reason. Arthur, stay in the room." So I stayed. I sat there while the attendant apologized to him. For his discomfort. I sat there while the people in the seats across from me looked away, suddenly very interested in their magazines. I sat there and felt the visibility of my skin turn into a target. It's a strange thing, being the most successful person in a room and simultaneously the most vulnerable. I tried to lose myself in work, but every time I moved, Miller would react. If I adjusted my blanket, he'd turn around and glare. If I typed too loudly, he'd huff and call for more booze. The flight was a slow-motion car crash, a series of microaggressions that were building up like steam in a pressure cooker. I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me. Some were sympathetic, sure, but most were just waiting for me to snap, waiting for the black CEO to turn into the angry black man. That's the trap. You see, if I react, I'm the problem. If I stay silent, I'm the victim. There is no middle ground when the world has already decided who you are before you even open your mouth. I remember looking out the window at the clouds, thinking about the irony of it all. Here we were, suspended in a multi-million-dollar tube of metal, flying over the greatest country on Earth, and we couldn't even manage the basic courtesy of existing in the same space. I thought about the black CEO narratives you see on social media, the polished photos, the inspiring quotes, the look at me, I made it posts. They never show you this part. They never show you the blood on the leather. They never tell you about the silence in a first-class cabin when a man is being told he doesn't belong. The internal conflict was tearing me apart. One half of me was the executive, the man who calculates risk and manages optics. That man was telling me to keep my cool, to document everything, to wait for the authorities on the ground. The other half of me was just a man who was tired of being a representative of his race, a man who just wanted to be a person. That man wanted to stand up and demand respect. As the plane continued its steep descent, the physical pain in my jaw started to dull into a heavy, throbbing ache. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my tablet. My face was lopsided, one side swollen and bruised. I looked like a stranger. I thought about the first-class experience I'd paid for, the extra leg room, the better food, the priority treatment. It felt like a joke. All the money in the world couldn't buy me a flight where I wasn't looking over my shoulder. It couldn't buy me a seat where the man in front of me didn't think he had the right to put his hands on me. The cabin lights began to flicker as the plane hit a patch of rough air. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed repeatedly, a frantic metallic sound that cut through the low-level chaos. The flight attendants were moving through the aisles now, their faces grim, checking that everyone was buckled in for the emergency landing. I saw the woman who had served me earlier. She stopped by my seat, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch my shoulder. "Are you okay?" "Sir," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I am so sorry. I didn't think. I should have done more." I looked at her, and for the first time since the punch, I felt a flicker of something other than rage. It was pity. She was just as much a prisoner of this system as I was. She was trained to keep the peace, to please the customer, to maintain the illusion of luxury at all costs. And in doing so, she'd been forced to watch a man be dehumanized in front of her. "It's not your fault," I said, though my voice was thick and distorted by the swelling. I looked back at Miller. He was slumped in his seat now, the bravado replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed terror as he realized the consequences of his actions. He was looking out the window, his hands clutching the armrests, his knuckles white. He wasn't the big man anymore. He was just a small, scared person who had let his hate run away with him. And now the entire world was literally falling out from under him. The pilot's voice came back on, sounding even more strained. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing. All passengers, brace positions." The plane was vibrating violently now. I could hear the roar of the wind outside, the sound of the flaps extending, the mechanical groan of the landing gear dropping into place. We were coming in hot. I could feel the descent in the pit of my stomach, a physical manifestation of the crash my life had just taken. I reached down and found my glasses on the floor. One of the lenses was cracked, a jagged spiderweb of lines across the vision. I put them on anyway, I wanted to see everything. I wanted to see the ground when we hit it. I wanted to see the look on the faces of the police when they boarded. I took a deep breath, the air tasting like ozone and fear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was cracked too, but it still worked. I opened the camera app and turned it toward myself. I took a photo of the blood, the bruise, and the first-class seat number. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I needed the evidence. I needed to prove that this happened. I needed to prove that even at 30,000 feet, in the most expensive seats on the plane, the old ghosts still haunt us. I thought about my daughters. I thought about the world I was trying to build for them. I'd told them that if they worked hard, if they were kind, if they were excellent, they could go anywhere. Was I lying to them? Was I setting them up for a fall? The thought hurt more than the punch. It was a deep, soul-shaking ache that made me want to scream into the pressurized cabin. But then, I remembered my father's other lesson, the one he told me right before I left for college. He'd held my hand, his grip still strong despite the years in the factory. "Arthur," he'd said, "the world will try to break you. It's designed to, but you are the blacksmith of your own soul. You take the heat, you take the hammer, and you turn yourself into something they can't break." I gripped the armrests. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't just a black CEO. I was the blacksmith. The plane roared as we cleared the final approach. I could see the lights of the runway rushing up to meet us, a blurred string of amber and white against the darkness. The cabin was silent now, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the impact. I looked at the red stain on the armrest one last time. It had stopped dripping. The blood was starting to dry, turning into a dark, stubborn crust. It was a mark of what had happened, a physical record of the violence, but it was also a reminder that I was still here. I was still breathing. I was still in the room. The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-jarring thud. The plane bounced once, twice. The engine, screaming in reverse, thrust as the pilot fought to bring the massive jet under control. We were fishtailing slightly, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin, but we were on the ground. We were safe, or at least, the plane was safe. As we slowed to a taxi, the silence in the cabin was broken by the sound of sirens. I looked out the window and saw a fleet of emergency vehicles racing toward us, their blue and red lights flashing against the gray morning sky. There were police cars, ambulances, and federal vehicles. This wasn't just a medical diversion. This was an intervention. I saw Miller sink lower into his seat. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the upholstery. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the flashing lights, his face pale and drawn. I sat up straight. I adjusted my ruined suit jacket. I wiped a stray drop of blood from my chin with the back of my hand. My head was still spinning, and my jaw felt like it was being held together by toothpicks. But I felt a strange sense of calm. The slow burn was over. The explosion had happened. Now, it was time for the fallout. The plane came to a final, shuddering stop on a remote taxiway, far from the main terminal. The engines whined down to a stop, leaving the cabin in a heavy, expectant quiet. We were waiting. I looked at the door at the front of the cabin. I knew what was coming next. I knew the questions, the statements, the long hours of bureaucracy that lay ahead. I knew that my perfect business trip was over, and that my life would never be quite the same after this. But as I sat there in the silence, I felt a resolve hardening inside me. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to let them settle this quietly. I was going to make sure that everyone on this plane, and everyone who heard this story, knew exactly what had happened in Seat 3B. I reached out and unbuckled my seatbelt. The click sounded like a starting pistol in the quiet cabin. I stood up, despite the wave of nausea that hit me, and I turned toward the front of the plane. I saw the lead flight attendant looking at me, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. I saw the other passengers staring, their faces a mix of guilt and curiosity. And then I heard it. The heavy thud of the jet bridge connecting to the side of the plane, the sound of the door seal breaking, the rush of outside air, cold, fresh, and smelling of the earth, flooding into the cabin. I stood in the aisle, my legs shaking but my head held high. I watched the door swing open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the cabin, their hands on their belts. Behind them were 2 men in dark suits, FBI or air marshals. I couldn't tell yet. They looked at the flight attendant. She pointed toward the first-class cabin. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I took 1 step forward, then another, my shoes clicking on the carpeted floor. I felt the eyes of every person on that plane on my back. I felt the weight of my father's legacy, the weight of my own success, and the weight of the blood on my shirt. I stopped right in front of the officers. I didn't say a word. I just looked them in the eye, my bruised face a silent testimony to everything that had transpired at 30,000 feet. The officer in the lead looked at me, then at the man in 2, then back at me. He saw the blood. He saw the suit. He saw the man. "Sir," he said, his voice low and professional. "Are you Arthur Sterling?" I nodded slowly, the movement sending a fresh jolt of pain through my jaw. "I am," I whispered. "We're going to need you to come with us," he said. I looked back at the cabin, at the luxury, the silence, and the man who had tried to break me. Then I turned and walked toward the open door, stepping out of the pressurized illusion and into the cold, hard light of the morning, where the sirens were still screaming, and the truth was waiting to be told. The air outside the cabin didn't just feel cold, it felt sharp, like 1,000 tiny needles of reality piercing through the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright. Stepping out of that pressurized tube was like waking up from a nightmare, only to find the sun was too bright and the ground was made of jagged stones. I stood on the top of the mobile stair unit, my hand gripping the cold metal railing so hard, my knuckles felt like they might burst through the skin. Below me, the tarmac was a sea of pulsating strobe lights, blue, red, and a blinding, clinical white that made the blood on my sleeve look almost black. I took a breath, and the sting in my jaw flared up. A hot, throbbing reminder that the CEO persona was currently a fractured mask. Have you ever felt the wind catch a wound? It's a strange sensation, a mix of cooling relief and a burning reminder that you're exposed. I looked down at the officers waiting for me, and for a split second, I felt that old, deep-seated instinct to apologize for existing. It's a ghost that lives in the marrow of many men who look like me, no matter how much money we make or how many people report to us. But as I started the descent down those metal steps, each clang of my heels sounding like a hammer on an anvil, I pushed that ghost back into the shadows. I wasn't the one who had turned a flight into a crime scene. "Mr. Sterling," one of the officers called out, his voice competing with the whine of a nearby generator. "Take it slow." "Sir, we have paramedics right here." I didn't want the paramedics. Not yet. I wanted the ground to stop moving. I wanted the ringing in my ears to be replaced by the truth. As I reached the bottom, a heavy blanket was draped over my shoulders by a woman in a high-visibility vest, but I barely felt the warmth. My eyes were locked on the back of the plane, where they were leading Miller down a separate set of stairs. He was handcuffed, his head bowed, The bravado that had fueled his right hook seemingly evaporated into the thin air of the runway. Seeing him like that didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it would. It just felt heavy. It felt like another brick added to a wall that had been building for 400 years. They ushered me into a mobile command unit, a sterile, cramped space that smelled of ozone, coffee, and industrial-grade disinfectant. An EMT began dabbing at my jaw with a cold antiseptic wipe, and I winced, the pain radiating all the way into my teeth. Across from me sat a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Agent Vance. He didn't look like the federal agents you see in the movies. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days and was tired of witnessing the worst parts of human nature. Mr. Sterling, I know you've been through a lot in the last hour, Vance said, his voice a low, steady rumble that finally started to ground me. But I need you to walk me through everything. From the moment you boarded. Don't leave anything out. The small stuff matters more than you think. I looked at the recorder on the table, its little red light blinking like a heartbeat. I started to talk, but my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone smaller. Someone wounded. I told him about the look in 2A. I told him about the mistake with the seating. I told him about the slow, agonizing buildup of microaggressions that felt like being pecked to death by 1,000 crows. As I spoke, I realized I was describing more than just a flight. I was describing the architecture of my entire life. I remembered a board meeting 3 years ago. I was pitching a merger, the one that actually led to the deal I just closed in New York. I had the data, the vision, and the capital, but one of the senior partners on the other side kept asking if my advisor was coming. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that I was the one holding the pen. I had smiled then. I had stayed professional. I had channeled all that frustration into a flawless execution of the deal. I thought that by winning, I was ending the argument. But sitting in that cold van, with blood drying on my charcoal wool, I realized the argument never ends. It just changes venues. He said I didn't belong there, I whispered, my voice finally cracking. He told me to stay down where I belong. Agent, I've spent 25 years making sure I never stayed down. I've outworked, outstudied, and outlasted everyone who told me I was a diversity hire or a lucky break. And yet, in seat 3B, none of that mattered. To him, I was just a target. Vance nodded, his pen scratching against a notepad. And the physical contact. Did you strike back? Mr. Sterling. Did you move toward him in a threatening manner? That was the question. The one I knew was coming. The one that determines whether the victim gets to stay the victim or becomes the co-combatant. I felt a flash of that blacksmith fire my father talked about. I looked Vance dead in the eye. I was buckled into my seat. Agent. My laptop was open. I was wearing noise-canceling headphones. I didn't even see the punch coming until it was too late. I didn't hit him back because if I did, we wouldn't be sitting in this van having this conversation. I'd be in the back of a squad car. And you know it. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Vance didn't look away. He didn't offer a platitude. He just leaned back and sighed. A sound of profound, weary recognition. We have the passenger statements, Arthur, and we have something else. A woman in 4B. She was recording a vlog about her luxury travel experience. She caught the whole thing. The verbal abuse, the punch, the way you stayed in your seat afterward. It's pretty graphic. A secret revealed. A digital witness I didn't even know existed. I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was undeniable, but dread because I knew what happens when these videos hit the light of day. I didn't want to be a viral video. I didn't want my face, bruised and bleeding, to be the thumbnail for 1,000,000 story-time videos. I wanted to be known for my leadership. My company. My family. I didn't want to be the black CEO who got punched. "Can I see it?" I asked. Vance hesitated, then turned a tablet toward me. I watched myself on that screen. It was like looking at a stranger in a documentary. I saw the man, Miller, standing over me. I saw the raw, unchecked venom in his expression. And then I saw the hit. My head snapped back with a violence that made me nauseous to watch. But what struck me most wasn't the punch. It was what happened after. I saw myself sitting there, perfectly still, staring into the distance while blood ran down my chin. I looked like a man who was already mourning the world he thought he lived in. I pushed the tablet away. I've seen enough. The EMT finished with my jaw, taping a sterile gauze pad over the worst of the swelling. "You're going to need x-rays." "Sir, it might be a hairline fracture. We've got an ambulance ready to take you to the local hospital." "No," I said, my voice firmer now. The CEO was starting to claw his way back to the surface. I have a family waiting for me in Los Angeles. I have a company to run. I just want to finish the statement and get home. "Arthur," Vance said, his tone softening. "The flight is grounded. The airline is putting the other passengers in a hotel. But you're a key witness in a federal assault case. You aren't going anywhere for a few hours. And honestly, you're in shock. You need to sit down." I stood up anyway. The van felt too small, too much like a cage. I stepped out back onto the tarmac, the wind whipping my hair. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon now, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I looked at the massive jet sitting a few hundred yards away, the unseen sky logo on its tail glinting in the early light. It looked like a ghost ship. I walked a few paces away from the command unit, toward the perimeter fence. I needed to hear a voice that wasn't an investigator's or a paramedic's. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen a spiderweb of cracks that distorted the time. 4:45 a.m. It would be 1:45 a.m. back in LA. My wife, Elena, would be asleep. She'd be curled up on her side of the bed, the one with the extra pillow, probably dreaming about the weekend we were supposed to have. I stared at her name in my contacts. My thumb hovered over the call icon. How do you tell the person you love that the world just tried to break you? How do you explain that the safety you worked so hard to buy for your family is an illusion that can be shattered by a man in 2/8? I thought about my daughters. They see me as a hero. They see me as the man who can fix anything, who knows every answer, who is invincible. If I called now, I'd be breaking that for them. I'd be introducing them to a fear they weren't ready for. I felt a tear slip from under my glasses, hot and stinging as it hit the edge of the gauze. I wasn't crying because of the pain. I was crying because of the exhaustion, the pure, unadulterated fatigue of having to be twice as good every single second of every single day. I was tired of being a symbol. I was tired of being a lesson. I looked back at the plane. A cleaning crew was boarding, their silhouettes moving through the windows of the first-class cabin. They were already scrubbing away the blood. They were erasing the evidence of the struggle so they could get the next group of premium passengers to their destination. The world moves on so fast, doesn't it? It has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of our trauma until it's just another delay in the system. I thought about the vlog. She caught the whole thing. Vance had said, soon, the internet would have its say. There would be analysis videos. There would be people defending Miller, saying he was stressed or provoked. There would be people using me as a political pawn. The blacksmith inside me felt a surge of defiance. If the world was going to use my image, they were going to get the whole story, not just the punch, but the man who stood up afterward. I clicked the call button. It rang 3 times before she picked up. Her voice thick with sleep and instant concern. "Arthur? Honey, it's so late. Are you okay? Did the flight land early?" I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cold chain-link fence. The smell of jet fuel and damp earth was heavy in the air. "Hey, baby," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I'm on the ground. There's been a change of plans." I stood there in the growing light, the sirens finally fading into a distant hum, as I began to describe the taste of the salt and the coldness of the suit, while the first real rays of the sun caught the cracked glass of my phone, reflecting 1,000 tiny rainbows across my trembling hand. The silence on the other end of the line was the heaviest thing I'd ever carried. Elena didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She just breathed. This slow, shaky exhale that sounded like a heart breaking in real time. I stood there, leaning my forehead against the cold, diamond-shaped gaps of the chain-link fence, watching the dawn turn the tarmac into a sheet of hammered silver. I told her everything. I told her about the taste of blood, the man in 2, and the way the cabin went silent when the punch landed. I told her I was safe, physically, but I knew I was lying. You're never really safe once you realize that the world you built for yourself is just a thin layer of glass. "Arthur," she finally whispered, her voice sounding like it was coming from a different planet. "Come home, please. Just don't worry about the deal. Don't worry about the company. Just get on a plane and come home to us." I promised her I would, but as I hung up the phone, I realized that home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a state of being that I had lost somewhere between JFK and this desolate runway in the middle of nowhere. I tucked the cracked phone back into my pocket and turned around to face the command van. The blue and red strobe lights were still pulsing, but they were losing their battle against the morning sun. The emergency crews were packing up. The show was over for them. But for me, the real work was just beginning. I walked back toward the terminal building. Escorted by Agent Vance, my legs felt like they were made of lead, and every step sent a fresh jolt of electricity through my jaw. We entered through a side door, bypassing the crowds, and ended up in a sterile, windowless conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-strength floor wax. There were 3 people waiting there. 2 were in suits that looked like they cost half as much as mine, and 1 was a woman in a crisp airline uniform. "Mr. Sterling," the woman said, stepping forward with a look of practiced concern. "I'm Sarah, the Regional Director of Guest Relations. We are beyond devastated by what happened today. This is not the standard of service we provide, and we are committed to making this right." I sat down in one of the hard plastic chairs. I didn't want a standard of service. I didn't want a gift card or a formal apology printed on heavy cardstock. I looked at her, and then at the 2 men, the airline's legal team, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I wasn't just a victim in their eyes. I was a liability. I was a potential PR nightmare that needed to be managed, tucked away, and settled before the news cycle caught wind of the Black CEO in first-class headline. "We've already initiated a lifetime ban for Mr. Miller," one of the lawyers said, sliding a folder across the table toward me, "and we are prepared to offer you a full refund of your travel, along with a significant credit and a private jet charter to take you the rest of the way to Los Angeles this morning. We just need you to sign a few documents, acknowledging that the airline handled the situation according to protocol." I looked at the folder. It was thick, It was full of words like indemnification, non-disclosure, and amicable resolution. They wanted me to go away. They wanted to buy my silence with a private flight and a few $1,000s in credit. They wanted to pretend that the environment on that plane wasn't a direct result of the culture they allowed to fester. "You think this is about the flight?" I asked. My voice was raspy, and it hurt to talk, but the words were steady. "You think I'm sitting here with a fractured jaw because I want a free trip to LA?" The room went quiet. Sarah looked at her shoes. The lawyers looked at each other. "Mr. Miller spent an hour telling your staff that I didn't belong there." I continued. He harassed me. He questioned my right to sit in a seat I paid for. And he did it all while your crew tried to keep the peace. Keeping the peace is what people do when they're too afraid to stand up for the truth. You didn't protect me. You managed me. And when he hit me, you didn't divert the plane because it was the right thing to do. You diverted it because you had to. Mr. Sterling, we understand your frustration. The second lawyer started, his tone becoming that specific kind of condescending professional that I've dealt with my entire career. But we have to look at the facts. We followed FAA regulations. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor like a scream. I'm done with your regulations. I'm done with your protocols. I'm going to go home. I'm going to see my family. And then, I'm going to tell this story. And I'm not going to tell it to your legal team. I'm going to tell it to anyone who will listen. I walked out of that room before they could say another word. Agent Vance was waiting in the hallway. He didn't say anything, but he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. He walked me through the back corridors of the airport until we reached the main terminal. It was early, but the building was starting to hum with the energy of a new day. People were rushing to gates, drinking coffee, laughing, complaining about their own minor inconveniences. As I walked through the terminal, I saw a reflection of myself in a large window. I stopped. My suit was rumpled. My tie was gone, and the white gauze on my face was stained with a pale pink circle of blood. I looked like a man who had been in a wreck. And then, I saw him, a few hundred feet away, near one of the high-security exits. Miller was being led away by two officers. He wasn't in handcuffs anymore, but he looked small, shrunken. His khakis were wrinkled, and his polo shirt was stained. He looked like a man whose entire world had just collapsed under the weight of his own anger. For a second, our eyes met. There was no fire in him anymore. There was only fear. He realized, finally, that the individual he had tried to humiliate was the one who held all the power now. I didn't feel the surge of revenge I expected. I didn't want to shout or point. I just felt a deep, profound sadness. This man had ruined his life, and very nearly mine, because he couldn't handle the sight of a black man sitting in a seat he felt entitled to. He was a prisoner of a hate that had finally turned inward on him. I turned away and kept walking. I found a quiet corner near a window that looked out over the gates. I sat down on a bench, the vinyl cold against my back, and I just watched the planes. I thought about my father's factory in Detroit. I thought about the smell of the grease and the way he used to scrub his hands until they were raw, trying to get the work off him before he touched us. He never complained. He just forged himself into a shield so his children wouldn't have to feel the heat. But sitting there, in that airport terminal, I realized that you can't shield your children forever. The only thing you can do is teach them how to stand in the fire. I pulled out my tablet. I looked at the photo I'd taken on the plane, the blood on the armrest, the bruise on my face, the first-class seat number. I thought about the vlog Vance had mentioned. I knew it was only a matter of time before it hit the internet. I could wait for the world to define me. Or I could define myself. I started to write. Not a press release. Not a legal statement. I wrote a letter to my daughters. I told them that the world is a beautiful place, but it's also a place where some people are still afraid of the light. I told them that success doesn't buy you an escape from reality. It just gives you a bigger platform to change it. I told them that their daddy got hit, but he didn't stay down. I posted the photo and the letter to my social media accounts. I didn't name the airline. I didn't name Miller. I just told the truth about what happened in Seat 3B. I told the story of a man who worked his whole life to get into the room, only to find out the room wasn't ready for him yet. By the time I boarded my flight home, a regular commercial flight, no private jet, sitting in the very back row because I wanted to be as close to the ground as possible, the post had gone viral. Thousands of comments, hundreds of shares, people telling their own stories of walking while black, flying while black, existing while black. I realized then that I wasn't alone. I was part of a chorus. The flight to LA was quiet. I sat by the window, my head resting against the cool plastic, watching the American landscape unfold beneath me. I saw the mountains, the plains, the tiny clusters of lights that represented thousands of lives being lived in the middle of all this chaos. I felt a strange sense of peace. The paper fortress was gone, but something stronger had taken its place. Something forged in the heat of that punch. When we landed at LAX, the sun was high in the sky. I walked through the terminal, my head held high, ignoring the curious glances at the bandage on my face. I stepped out into the humid California air and saw Elena. She was standing by the curb, her face pale, her eyes searching the crowd. When she saw me, she didn't run. She just stood there, her hand over her heart, as if she were making sure I was real. I walked up to her and pulled her into my arms. I buried my face in her neck. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and home, filling my lungs. I felt the tension finally leave my shoulders. I felt the CEO mask fall away completely, leaving just a man who was tired, bruised, but finally, truly home. "You're okay," she whispered, her tears wetting the shoulder of my ruined suit. "You're okay." "I am," I said, and for the first time that day, I meant it. We drove home in silence, the palm trees blurred by the speed of the car. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw my daughters standing on the porch. They looked scared, but they were standing tall. I got out of the car, and they ran to me, their small arms wrapping around my waist, their voices a jumble of questions. And I love yous. I knelt down and looked them in the eyes. I didn't hide the bandage. I didn't hide the swelling. I let them see the truth. "Listen to me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, life is gonna throw a punch you don't see coming. It's going to hurt. It's gonna make you want to stay down. But you look at me. You look at what I'm doing right now. You stand up. You tell your truth. And you never, ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong in the seat you're sitting in." They nodded, their eyes wide and solemn. They understood, not the politics, not the legalities, but the heart of it. They saw their father, not as an invincible hero, but as a man who chose his dignity over his comfort. That night, as the house went quiet and the moon rose over the Pacific, I sat in my office. I looked at the deal I had closed in New York. It was worth millions. It was a career-defining achievement, but it felt like a footnote. The real deal, the one that mattered, was the one I'd made with myself on that tarmac. I'm sharing this story with you today, not because I want your pity, and not because I want to start a fight. I'm sharing it because I want you to know that the scars under the suit are real. We all carry them. But those scars, they aren't signs of weakness. They're proof that we survived. They're the map of our journey from the factory floor to the boardroom, and every stop in between. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever felt the sting of a world that refuses to see you, I want you to do one thing for me. Stand up. Don't shout. Don't hit back with hate. Just stand up and occupy your space, because they can delay your flight, and they can bruise your face, but they can't touch your soul unless you hand it to them. And we aren't handing over anything anymore. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't the one I planned to tell today, but it's the one I needed to share. If this spoke to you, if you found a bit of your own strength in my struggle, please hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you had to forge your own path through the fire. I'll be reading every single one. We're in this together. I'm Arthur Sterling. I'm a father, a husband, and a CEO, and I'm right where I belong. Stay strong. Keep your head high, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there. The air in the executive suite of Sterling Tech was different on Monday morning. Usually, it smelled of expensive roast coffee and the crisp, ozone scent of high-end air purifiers. It was the smell of productivity, of progress, of a machine running at peak efficiency. But today, as I walked through the glass doors, the air felt thick, heavy with the kind of silence that usually precedes a firing or a massive quarterly loss. I was wearing a new suit, a deep midnight blue, but it didn't feel like armor this time. It felt like a costume, beneath the fabric. My jaw was still tender, a dull throb reminding me of the tarmac every time I spoke. The stairs were the hardest part. My employees, people I'd known for a decade, looked at me, then quickly looked away. They weren't looking at their CEO, they were looking at the man in the video. Over the weekend, my post had reached 20 million views. The black CEO had become a trending topic, a talking point for news anchors and social media activists alike. I had opened a door I couldn't close, and as I walked toward the boardroom for the emergency meeting with my lead director, I realized that the first-class punch was just the beginning. The real battle was about to happen in the very room I thought I owned. "Arthur, thank you for coming in on such short notice," Marcus said as I entered. Marcus was the lead director of our board, a man I'd considered a mentor for years. He was an older white man with a penchant for golf metaphors and a reputation for navigating stormy waters. Today, he didn't look like a mentor. He looked like a man who was calculating the cost of my dignity and stock points. I sat down, the leather of the executive chair creaking. "I assume we're here to talk about the merger. Marcus, we're here to talk about the Sterling brand." "Arthur," he countered, sliding a tablet toward me. It was a report on our social media sentiment. The merger with Vance Global is on a knife's edge. They're old school. Arthur, they like their executives to stay in the business sections, not the viral tabloids. Your post, it was powerful. Don't get me wrong, but it's political. And politics is bad for the bottom line. I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest, the same heat I felt when Miller looked at my ticket and saw a mistake. It's not politics, Marcus. It's my life. I was assaulted. I was humiliated in a cabin I paid to be in. Am I supposed to pretend it didn't happen to make the investors comfortable? Marcus sighed, leaning back. No one is saying it didn't happen. But the legal team at Vance Global is worried. They see a CEO who is now a lightning rod. They're asking if you're going to be focused on scaling the new AI architecture, or if you're going to be on a speaking tour about racial justice. They want a leader, not a symbol. The word symbol hit me like a second punch. For 20 years, I had worked to be a leader who just happened to be black. I had followed the rules of the corporate game, thinking that if I won, the black part would become secondary to the CEO part. But Marcus was telling me that the moment I spoke up about my reality, I had forfeited my right to be seen as just a businessman. To them, my trauma was a distraction. My humanity was a liability. I can be both, I said, my voice low and steady, channeling the blacksmith. I can be the man who closes the biggest tech merger of the decade and the man who refuses to be silenced by a bigot. If Vance Global can't handle a CEO with a spine, maybe they aren't the right partners for us. Marcus's face went pale. Arthur, don't be reckless. We're talking about a $3 billion valuation. The board is prepared to offer you a significant bonus, a hardship compensation, if you agree to take down the post and issue a joint statement with the airline saying the matter has been resolved privately. We can bury this. Arthur, we can go back to being just tech. Bury it. They wanted to bury the blood on the armrest. They wanted to bury the look on my daughter's faces. They wanted me to sell my truth for a bonus and a smooth merger. I looked around the boardroom, the mahogany table, the panoramic view of the city, the awards on the wall. I had spent my life building this paper fortress. And now, the people inside it were asking me to burn the bridge I'd used to get here. I thought about my father. I thought about those oil-stained hands and the way he'd look at me after a shift at the factory. He never had a boardroom. He never had a merger. But he had his word. He had his name. If he had seen me sitting there, negotiating the price of my own silence, he wouldn't have recognized me. The post stays up. Marcus, I said, standing up. My jaw ached, but my heart felt lighter than it had in days. And the statement I'm going to issue won't be with the airline. It will be to our shareholders. I'm going to tell them that Sterling Tech is a company that values its people over its optics. And if Vance Global wants to walk away because their CEO has a bruised face and a loud voice, let them walk. I'll find a partner who isn't afraid of the truth. I walked out of that boardroom without waiting for a response. I didn't go back to my office. I went down to the lobby, where the security guards and the receptionists were watching me. These were the people who kept the building running, the ones who didn't have paper fortresses to hide behind. As I passed the front desk, the young woman working there, a black girl in her early 20s with braids and a bright smile, caught my eye. Mr. Sterling, she whispered. I stopped. Yes, thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. My little brother saw your video. He wants to be a developer now. He didn't think people like us could, well, he didn't think we could be the boss and keep our pride. You showed him he could. I felt a lump in my throat that no corporate bonus could ever touch. I realized then that the board was wrong. I wasn't a lightning rod because I was a liability. I was a lightning rod because I was a light. For the first time in my career, I wasn't just Arthur Sterling, CEO. I was Arthur Sterling, a man who belonged in the room. And I was making sure the door stayed open for everyone coming behind me. I stepped out into the California sun, the city humming with a different kind of energy. The merger might fail, the stock might dip, but for the first time in 20 years, when I looked at my reflection in the glass of my building, I didn't see a mask. I saw the blacksmith, and he was just getting started. 3 weeks after the flight, the world had moved on to the next viral scandal, but the echoes were still loud in my head. I was sitting in a quiet, sun-drenched cafe in Silver Lake, waiting for someone I had never met in person, but whose eyes I had seen through a digital lens. Her name was Maya, the woman from seat 4B, the one who had recorded the video that changed my life. When she walked in, she didn't look like a viral whistleblower. She looked like a college student, oversized sweater, messy bun, and a nervous energy that made her tap her fingers against her phone. She spotted me and froze for a second, her eyes scanning the bandage that was now just a thin, fading scar on my jaw. "Mr. Sterling," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. I wasn't sure you'd actually come." I had to say thank you. "Maya," I said, pushing a cup of coffee toward her, "and I wanted to make sure you were okay. I heard the internet hasn't been kind to you either." She bit her lip, looking down at her coffee. "They found my school. They found my parents' address. People are calling me a clout chaser. They're saying I orchestrated the whole thing for views, and Miller's supporters. They're sending me threats. They say I ruined an innocent man's life." I felt a familiar pang of guilt. My victory had a cost, and this girl, who had just been trying to vlog her vacation, was paying a portion of it. "Maya, you didn't ruin his life. He ruined his own when he decided his hate was more important than the law. You just provided the mirror. People hate looking into mirrors when they don't like what's looking back." We sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the espresso machine and the low chatter of the cafe filling the space. I looked at her, and I saw a different version of myself, the younger, more idealistic version that hadn't yet learned how to build a fortress. "Why did you keep filming?" I asked. "In the video, I saw you shaking. You were clearly terrified." She looked up, and for the first time, I saw the steel in her eyes, because I've seen it happen before. "Mr. Sterling," to my dad, to my cousins, but it always happens in the dark, in an alley, or a parking lot, or a quiet street where it's their word against ours. But this was first class. This was under the bright lights of a plane. I realized that if I didn't record it, people would find a way to make it your fault. They'd say you were aggressive, or you were drunk, or you started it. I couldn't let them do that to you. It was a profound realization. Even with my wealth, my title, and my Italian suit, I still needed a 20-year-old with a smartphone to protect my truth. The meritocracy I had believed in was a lie if it didn't include the power to be believed. "You're a storyteller, Maya," I said, whether you meant to be or not. "You told a story that the world needed to see, and you did it at a risk to yourself." "I lost my internship," she said quietly. "The firm said I was too controversial now. They didn't want the drama associated with my name." I leaned forward, the CEO and me taking over. "What was the internship for?" "Digital marketing and narrative strategy," she replied. "I want to help small businesses tell their stories, brands that actually mean something." I smiled, and for the first time, it didn't hurt my jaw. "Sterling Tech is looking for a new director of narrative impact. We're moving away from corporate neutrality and focusing on authentic storytelling. We need someone who isn't afraid to hold up the mirror, even when the image is ugly." Maya's eyes went wide. Are you serious?" "I don't make business offers. I'm not serious about it." "Maya, you showed me that the unseen truths are the only ones worth telling. I want you to help me tell them." As we walked out of the cafe together, the sun was hitting the Hollywood Hills in the distance. The unseen sky was no longer just a name on a plane or a tagline for a channel. It was a mission. I realized that my journey wasn't about the punch or the merger anymore. It was about the bridge between my generation, the one that learned to survive by being twice as good, and Maya's generation, the one that was brave enough to demand that the world be better. I drove home that evening, the radio playing something soulful and low. When I pulled into my driveway, My daughters were playing on the lawn. They saw the car and came running, their laughter a healing balm for everything I'd endured. I picked them both up, feeling their small heartbeats against mine. "Daddy, is the bad man gone?" the youngest asked, touching the scar on my jaw with a tiny finger. "The man is gone, sweetie," I said, kissing her forehead. But the story is just getting started. And it's a story about how we aren't afraid of the dark anymore. That night, I sat in my office and looked at the viral video one last time. I watched the moment Miller's fist connected with my face. I watched the blood. I watched the silence. But then, I looked closer. I saw Maya's hand in the corner of the frame, steady despite the shaking. I saw the flight attendant's face. I saw the collective realization of the passengers. I closed the laptop and looked out at the Pacific. I wasn't just a CEO. I wasn't just a victim. I was a man who had been tempered in the fire and emerged as something stronger. The blacksmith had finally finished the work. I was Arthur Sterling, and for the first time in 48 years, I knew exactly who I was, where I belonged, and exactly how much my voice was worth. The sky was vast, dark, and full of stars, unseen truths waiting to be told. And as I turned off the light, I knew that tomorrow I'd wake up and tell another one.